Before I begin, if you've ever known what it feels like to count coins at midnight, wondering how love alone will feed a child, please leave a comment, and subscribe to Voice of Legends. I never imagined my life would be reduced to a glowing phone screen and a half-empty can of baby formula. But that night, sitting on the edge of a sagging mattress in our one-room apartment, that's exactly where I was. My son, Mateo, was finally asleep in the bassinet beside me, his tiny chest rising and falling like a fragile promise. The room smelled faintly of laundry soap and warm milk, and the radiator clicked in protest against the winter cold seeping through the walls. I checked the clock again. 1:47 a.m. Too late to call anyone. Not that there was anyone left to call. I was 26 years old, a single mother working 2 part-time jobs that still didn't cover rent, childcare, and food. Mateo's father had disappeared before my belly even started to show, leaving behind nothing but unanswered messages and a silence that hurt more than anger ever could. My parents had passed years earlier. Friends helped when they could, but everyone had their own lives, their own limits. Pride had kept me quiet for months, but hunger has a way of stripping pride bare. I unscrewed the lid of the formula can and tilted it gently. Barely enough powder clung to the bottom to make 1 more bottle, maybe 2 if I stretched it dangerously thin. My hand shook as I set it down. Mateo would wake in a few hours, crying with that raw, desperate sound that cut straight through my chest. I swallowed hard, blinked back tears, and picked up my phone. I had been texting a local community number earlier that week, asking about emergency assistance. I scrolled through my messages, found the last thread, and hit reply without thinking. My fingers hovered over the screen, then started typing words I never thought I'd send to a stranger. Hi, I'm so sorry to bother you so late. I think I might have the wrong number. I'm a single mom and I'm short on baby formula this week. I hate asking, but if there's any chance you could help, even a little, I'd be so grateful. Please forgive me if this isn't who I think it is. I stared at the message for a long time before pressing send. My heart pounded with shame the moment it disappeared into the digital void. I set the phone down quickly as if it had burned me and whispered to myself that nothing would come of it. People didn't answer messages like that, not strangers, not at that hour. I lay back on the mattress, staring at the water stain on the ceiling, listening to the distant sounds of traffic and sirens, and told myself I'd figure something out in the morning. I must have drifted off for a few minutes because the vibration startled me awake. The phone buzzed once, sharp and sudden. For a second, I didn't move. I was afraid to look, afraid of rejection, afraid of cruelty, afraid of hope. Mateo stirred, letting out a soft sigh, and I reached for the phone with trembling fingers. The message was short. I think you have the wrong number, but tell me, how old is your baby? I sat up so fast the mattress creaked. My first instinct was to apologize and disappear. Instead, something steadier took over. Maybe exhaustion, maybe honesty. I typed back, "He's 3 months old. His name is Mateo. I'm sorry again. Please don't feel obligated to respond." There was a pause. 1 minute, 2 minutes. My stomach twisted itself into knots. Then another message appeared. "Are you safe right now? Do you have food for yourself?" The concern in that question made my throat tighten. I hadn't expected kindness, certainly not from someone who'd just been inconvenienced by my mistake. I wrote, "I'm okay, just struggling, like a lot of people, I guess." The reply came almost immediately this time. "Can you tell me where you're located? City is fine." Alarm bells rang in my head. Every warning I'd ever heard about strangers and the internet surfaced all at once. But something about the tone, calm, measured, human, kept me from panicking. I answered cautiously, giving only my city. "Thank you," the person replied. "I'd like to help. What's the cost of the formula you need?" I stared at the screen, convinced this had to be a prank, or worse, a scam. My thumb hovered as doubt battled desperation. Finally, I typed the truth. About $42. I can pay it forward someday, I promise. What happened next felt unreal. My phone chimed again, and when I opened the message, my breath caught. I've just sent $500. It should arrive shortly. Please use it for whatever you and Mateo need most. I let out a sound that was half sob, half laugh. My vision blurred as tears spilled over, dripping onto the phone screen. I checked my banking app again and again until the numbers settled into place, undeniable and real. $500, more money than I'd seen in my account in months. I typed thank you so many times, deleting and rewriting, unable to capture what I felt. Before I could send anything, another message came through. And please don't feel embarrassed. Asking for help takes courage. I'm glad you reached out, even by accident. That was the moment something inside me broke open, not in pain, but in relief. I pressed my palm to my mouth to keep from waking Mateo as I cried silently in the dim light of the room. I didn't know who this person was. I didn't know why they'd chosen to help. I only knew that, for the first time in a long while, I could breathe. I sent a final message that night, thanking them again and wishing them well. They replied simply, "Take care of your son. That's the most important job there is." I didn't learn who they were until days later. At that point, they were just a stranger who'd shown me mercy when I needed it most. I didn't know that a single mistaken text had just opened a door to a story far bigger than formula money. A story about dignity, generosity, and the quiet ways lives can change when one person decides to answer instead of ignore. The next morning, sunlight crept through the thin blinds like it was afraid to disturb us. Mateo woke with his usual hungry cry, but this time I didn't feel that familiar spike of panic in my chest. I held him close, warming a full bottle without counting scoops or stretching ounces. As he drank, his tiny hand wrapped around my finger, and I felt something close to peace settle over me. It wasn't just the money. It was the reminder that someone out there had seen me, even briefly, and chosen kindness. I spent that day doing things I hadn't been able to do in weeks. I bought enough formula to last the month. I filled the fridge with groceries instead of apologizing to it for being empty. I paid the electric bill before the final notice could arrive. Each small act felt like reclaiming a piece of myself I'd lost to survival mode. Still, in the back of my mind, I kept thinking about the stranger on the other end of that text message. Who were they? Why had they helped so generously? And would I ever hear from them again? 3 days passed without a word. I assumed that was the end of it, and in a way, I hoped it was. Some things are too pure to question too deeply. Then, on the 4th evening, my phone buzzed while I was rocking Mateo to sleep. "Hi, I hope this isn't intrusive. I just wanted to check in and make sure you and your son are okay." I stared at the message, smiling before I even realized I was. "We are," I replied, "more than okay. Thank you again. I don't think you know what that meant to us." There was a pause, longer this time, as if the person on the other end was choosing their words carefully. When the reply came, it surprised me. "I'm glad. If you don't mind me asking, how did you end up on your own with a newborn?" I hesitated. This wasn't something I usually shared, especially not with a stranger, but something about the conversation felt safe, unforced. I told the story simply, about a relationship that promised stability and delivered absence, about finding out I was pregnant and being told it wasn't his problem, about working until the week before Mateo was born and returning to work before my body had fully healed because bills don't wait for grief. When I finished typing, my chest felt lighter, like I'd set down a heavy bag I'd been carrying too long. The reply came slowly. "That must have taken incredible strength. I'm sorry you went through that alone." I closed my eyes at those words. Strength was not how I'd described myself lately. Tired, scared, overwhelmed, yes, but strong? Hearing it from someone else made me sit up a little straighter. We started exchanging messages every few days after that. Nothing intrusive, just check-ins. Sometimes they asked about Mateo, sometimes about my work schedule, sometimes they shared small pieces of their own life, carefully measured. I learned they traveled often, that they valued privacy, that they believed most people were doing the best they could with what they had. They never bragged, never offered advice unless I asked, and never made me feel small. It wasn't until a week later that I accidentally learned who they were. I was waiting in the line at the grocery store, Mateo strapped to my chest, when my phone buzzed with a news alert. The headline featured a familiar name, one I'd seen attached to tech companies and philanthropic foundations, someone whose face appeared occasionally on magazine covers I never bought. The name was uncommon enough that my stomach dropped instantly. I opened our message thread and scrolled back. There it was, the same name attached to the contact I'd accidentally texted. My hands went cold. I looked down at Mateo, then back at the screen, my heart racing. A billionaire, an actual billionaire, had sent me $500 without hesitation, then checked on me like a concerned neighbor. The realization made me dizzy. I didn't know whether to feel foolish, embarrassed, or terrified that I'd crossed some invisible line. I didn't say anything right away. I needed time to process. That night, after Mateo was asleep, I finally typed, "I think I realized who you are. I had no idea. I'm so sorry if I overstepped." The response came quicker than I expected. "You didn't overstep. You didn't know. And honestly, I prefer it that way. I'm just a person who got a message from another person who needed help." That answer told me more about their character than any headline ever could. Still, I felt a shift in the air between us. Awareness changes things, even when you don't want it to. Over the next few weeks, our conversations deepened, though we were both careful. They asked thoughtful questions about my hopes, not just my struggles. I found myself talking about things I'd buried under diapers and deadlines: my love for writing, my abandoned plans for college, the quiet fear that my life would always be this small. They listened, truly listened, and when they spoke, it was with a humility that didn't match their wealth. One evening, they asked if I'd ever considered going back to school. I laughed softly before replying, "All the time. I just don't see how that's possible right now." "What if it were?" they asked. The question lingered long after I set the phone down. I told myself not to read into it. People ask hypothetical questions all the time, but something told me this wasn't idle curiosity. A few days later, they asked if I'd be open to meeting in person, just once, in a public place, no obligations. My first instinct was no. My second was fear. My third was curiosity, and that one surprised me. I thought about it all night, weighing every risk, every reason. In the end, I agreed, with conditions. A cafe during the day, Mateo with me, no photos, no expectations. The cafe was small and warm, tucked into a quiet street. I arrived early, heart pounding, scanning every face that walked in. When they entered, there was no entourage, no drama, just a tall, slightly tired-looking man in a simple coat, eyes searching the room until they found mine. "Hi," he said gently, like we were old acquaintances. "Hi," I replied, standing awkwardly, Mateo shifting against me. We talked for an hour about nothing and everything. Mateo charmed him immediately, gripping his finger just like he did mine. I watched the billionaire, this man whose net worth could change cities, soften completely in the presence of a drooling baby. It was then I understood that money might open doors, but it doesn't fill all the rooms inside a person. Before we left, he said something I'll never forget. "He doesn't believe in accidents," he said. "I think people cross paths for a reason. If you're open to it, I'd like to help, not just with money, but with opportunity, on your terms." I went home that day overwhelmed, hopeful, and scared in equal measure. I didn't know what accepting help like that would mean for my independence, my pride, my future, but I knew one thing for certain. That mistaken text had already changed us, and the story was far from over. I spent the next few days replaying his words over and over in my head. On your terms. They echoed while I washed bottles, while I folded laundry, while I rocked Mateo through his evening fussiness. Opportunity was a beautiful word, but it was also heavy. I'd learned the hard way that nothing given comes without cost, even if the cost isn't obvious at first. I didn't want to trade one kind of struggle for another. When he messaged again, he didn't push. He simply asked how Mateo was doing. That restraint mattered more than he probably knew. It gave me the space to respond honestly, not out of pressure or gratitude, but choice. I've been thinking about what you said, I finally wrote. I'm open to talking more, slowly. His reply came with no fanfare. Slow is good. Tell me what would feel helpful right now. I stared at the screen for a long time. What would feel helpful? Not a miracle, not a rescue. What I wanted more than anything was stability, a chance to stop living one missed paycheck away from disaster. I told him that. I told him I wanted to go back to school someday, but that childcare and time were my biggest barriers. I told him I didn't want handouts that would disappear and leave me worse off emotionally. Then let's focus on building, not rescuing, he wrote. Would you be willing to let me help you find resources and fill the gaps where they fall short? That felt different, respectful, like a partnership, even though the balance between us was wildly uneven. I agreed. Over the next month, things began to shift, quietly but steadily. He connected me with a nonprofit childcare program I'd never heard of, one that prioritized single parents returning to school or job training. When the wait list threatened to stall everything, he didn't call in favors or flash his name. He simply donated anonymously to expand a few spots. One of them became mine. He helped me enroll in an online community college program covering tuition without ever mentioning the amount. When I tried to thank him, he deflected gently. I'm investing in a future, he said. That's all. I kept my jobs even when he suggested I could cut back. I needed to feel grounded in my own effort, but the pressure eased enough that I could breathe. For the first time since Mateo was born, I wasn't just surviving, I was planning. We met a handful of times during those months, always casually. Coffee, a walk in the park. He never brought gifts, never crossed a line. He asked permission before holding Mateo. He listened more than he spoke, and slowly, without either of us meaning it, trust began to grow. Still, the world has a way of complicating even the best intentions. One afternoon, I received an email from a gossip blog. Someone had seen us together at the cafe weeks earlier, a blurry photo, speculation. The subject line made my stomach drop. Tech mogul's secret family? I forwarded it to him immediately, hands shaking. I'm so sorry, I wrote. I never wanted this. His response was calm but serious. Thank you for telling me right away. This is why I value your honesty. I'll handle it. And he did, quietly. The post never went live. No threats, no spin, just a firm boundary drawn. He explained later that privacy was a non-negotiable part of his life, and anyone who crossed it didn't stay in his orbit long. That was the first time I truly saw the weight he carried. Money didn't insulate him from intrusion, it attracted it. I realized then that while my life had been defined by scarcity, his was shaped by constant surveillance, different struggles, real ones. As months passed, Mateo grew into a chubby, laughing baby who recognized our routines. He smiled when my phone buzzed, as if he somehow knew that the person on the other end had become part of our story. I never let myself romanticize that connection. I kept it grounded in gratitude and boundaries, but I couldn't deny the warmth that crept in when I saw his name on my screen. One evening, after a particularly hard day juggling classes and work, I broke down. I called him, not texted. My voice cracked as I apologized for calling so late. "You don't have to apologize," he said gently. "What's going on?" I told him everything: the exhaustion, the fear of failing, the guilt of not being enough for Mateo. When I finished, there was a long silence on the line. I worried I'd said too much. When he spoke again, his voice was quieter than I'd ever heard it. "I lost my mother when I was young. She raised me alone for years before that. I remember watching her cry at the kitchen table, thinking I was asleep. She thought I never noticed, but I did. And I grew up knowing exactly how loved I was, even when we struggled." Tears streamed down my face as he continued. "Mateo will know that too, because you're showing up every day." That was the night something shifted inside me. Not into romance, not yet, but into a deeper understanding. We weren't just two people connected by a mistake. We were two lives shaped by absence and perseverance, meeting in the middle of a story that demanded gentleness. By the time Mateo turned 1, my life looked nothing like it had that night on the mattress. I was halfway through my program. I'd saved enough to move into a slightly bigger apartment. I'd learned to ask for help without losing myself. And one afternoon, as we sat in the park watching Mateo wobble across the grass, he asked me a question that made my heart stop. He said, "What would it look like," he carefully asked, "if we stopped pretending this connection was temporary?" I didn't answer right away. I watched my son fall, laugh, and get back up. Then I looked at the man beside me, someone who entered my life by accident and stayed by choice. "I think," I said slowly, "it would look like honesty and patience and protecting Mateo above all else." He nodded. "That's exactly what I want." I didn't know then where that path would lead. I only knew that the future no longer felt like a locked door. It felt like a road, uncertain, yes, but finally visible. We didn't rush anything after that conversation in the park. If anything, we slowed down even more. It felt important to do it right, not just for us, but for Mateo, whose world was still forming in soft edges and familiar faces. I'd seen too many children learn instability too early. I promised myself my son wouldn't be one of them. We talked about boundaries first, about what he could and couldn't be in Mateo's life, about how I never wanted my child to feel like someone could disappear without explanation. He listened carefully, never defensive, never dismissive. He admitted his own fears, too, that he'd spent most of his adult life guarding himself from people who wanted what he had, not who he was, that opening his life to a child scared him more than any business risk ever had. "I don't want to be another almost," he said one evening as we sat across from each other at my tiny kitchen table. "If I step into this, I want it to mean something." Those words stayed with me. Almosts had defined so much of my past. Almost a family, almost security, almost hope. I wasn't willing to live in that space anymore. So we took it step by step. He became a regular presence, not a spectacle. He helped with bedtime sometimes, reading to Mateo in a calm, steady voice that made my son lean into his chest. He learned how to warm bottles just right, and how Mateo liked his back rubbed when he was fussy. There were no grand gestures, no expensive toys, just consistency. And I learned that consistency, more than anything, is what builds trust. Of course, the world didn't stop being complicated just because my heart was starting to feel steadier. Whispers followed him everywhere. I noticed it the first time we went somewhere slightly more public together. The glances, the phone subtly lifted. I felt myself tense, instinctively pulling Mateo closer. He noticed immediately. "We can leave," he said softly. "No, I replied after a moment. I don't want to live like we're hiding. I just want to live carefully. That balance became our quiet mission. He arranged to schedule so we could spend time together away from crowds. When attention was unavoidable, he made sure I understood what was happening, never leaving me blindsided. It wasn't about control, it was about respect. Then came the day everything was tested. I was at class when my phone started buzzing nonstop. Unknown numbers, emails, messages from people I didn't recognize. Panic crawled up my spine as I excused myself and stepped into the hallway. A friend had sent me a link with one line of text. "Is this you?" An article had gone live. Not speculative this time, confident. It told a story of a struggling single mother and a powerful billionaire, framing it as a modern fairy tale with a sharp undercurrent of suspicion. It included details about my past I'd never shared publicly, old social media photos, misrepresented quotes. It painted me as opportunistic, calculated, someone who trapped a powerful man with a baby that wasn't even his. I felt sick. By the time I got home, he was already there. He stood up the moment I walked in, his face tight with anger I'd never seen before. "I'm so sorry," he said immediately. "This should never have happened." I dropped my bag and sank onto the couch, tears spilling before I could stop them. "I didn't ask for this. I didn't plan any of it." He sat beside me, careful, grounding. "I know, and anyone who actually knows me knows that too, but we still have to deal with the noise." For the first time since I'd known him, the imbalance between our worlds felt overwhelming. He had teams, lawyers, advisors. I had my son, my resolve, and a knot of fear in my chest. I worried about Mateo growing up under scrutiny, about doors closing because of a narrative I didn't control. "I won't let this hurt him," I said fiercely. He met my gaze, equally resolute. "Neither will I." What followed was not dramatic revenge or public statements. It was something quieter, more deliberate. He refused to fuel the story. No interviews, no denials that would only fan the flames. Instead, he did something I didn't expect. He stepped back, publicly. He released a brief statement saying he was focusing on personal matters and would be limiting public appearances. Then he disappeared from the spotlight almost entirely. Meetings moved, schedules changed, and in that silence, the story lost oxygen. New scandals replaced it. Attention shifted, as it always does. But the cost of that decision hit me when he admitted what it meant. "I've spent my life building things," he said one night as we cleaned up after dinner. "Stepping back feels like letting go of control, but some things matter more." I realized then that sacrifice doesn't always look like loss to the outside world. Sometimes it's invisible, measured only by what someone is willing to give up when no one's watching. Life settled down again, though it was a different kind of settled, more intentional, more protected. I finished my program with honors. I found a job I loved, work that challenged me and paid enough that I could contribute fully to our life. That mattered deeply to me. I needed to stand on my own feet, not be carried. When Mateo turned 3, he called him something that made my breath catch. Not Dad, not yet, but a name that belonged only to them, born of routine and trust. I watched the way they looked at each other, the way safety flowed between them, and I knew something unshakable had been built. One evening, after Mateo was asleep, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, simple box. No cameras, no audience, just us sitting on the same couch where I'd once cried in fear. "I'm not asking you to step into my world. I'm asking to be part of yours, fully, if that's something you want." I thought of that night months ago, counting formula scoops, sending a text I almost deleted. I thought of every version of myself that had survived long enough to reach this moment. "Yes," I said, not because he was powerful, not because he was generous, but because he had shown me, again and again, who he was when no one was watching. Our life together wasn't a fairy tale. It was quieter than that, richer in ways money can't touch. Mateo grew up knowing where he came from, knowing his story began with struggle, but was shaped by love, resilience, and the courage to ask for help. Sometimes, late at night, I still think about that wrong number, that fragile moment when everything could have gone unanswered, and I remind myself of the lesson that carried me here. Kindness doesn't always wrap in familiarity. Sometimes it arrives by accident, and when it does, the bravest thing you can do is answer back with honesty, boundaries, and hope. Marriage didn't change our lives in the way people expected to, with sudden perfection or ease. If anything, it made us more deliberate. We didn't rush into living arrangements or public announcements. We chose privacy, stability, and routine over spectacle. The world still saw him as a billionaire who'd stepped back from the spotlight, and me as a woman who'd briefly flickered across gossip pages before fading again into anonymity. And that was exactly how we wanted it. We moved into a modest house on a quiet street where no one cared who you were as long as you waved back and kept your lawn trimmed. The first night we spent there as a family, I stood in the doorway of Mateo's new bedroom and watched him sleep, surrounded by soft blankets and shelves we'd built together. Not bought, built. I felt something settle in my chest that I hadn't realized I'd been carrying for years. Safety. Not the fragile kind that depends on circumstances, but the solid kind that grows from trust. He was careful with his role in Mateo's life. He never tried to replace a father Mateo had never known. Instead, he became something steadier, a presence, a guide, a man who showed up to preschool events and knelt to tie shoes and stayed up late assembling toys that came with too many instructions. Mateo watched him closely, absorbing everything, and I saw how love can teach without speaking. As Mateo grew older, questions naturally came. Children have a way of sensing the edges of their stories. One evening, while we were washing dishes together, he asked me why his last name was different from his. I took a breath, dried my hands, and sat with him at the table. I told him the truth, in words a child could carry, that families are made in many ways, that sometimes people come into your life later, but that doesn't make their love any less real. He listened, brow furrowed, then nodded like he'd filed the information away for later understanding. That night, as he hugged us both before bed, he didn't seem confused or afraid, just secure. That mattered more than anything. There were moments when the weight of my husband's former life tried to creep back in. Invitations to high-profile events, requests for interviews framed as human interest. Each time we chose together. Sometimes the answer was no. Sometimes it was a quiet donation or appearance that served a purpose larger than us. He never made those decisions alone, and he never assumed I'd follow his lead without discussion. Partnership, I learned, is built in those small moments of mutual respect. Years passed gently. Mateo started school. I advanced in my career. The house filled with laughter, scraped knees, science projects, and bedtime stories. Wealth existed around us, but it never defined us. We lived comfortably, yes, but consciously. Mateo learned the value of work, empathy, and responsibility. He learned where help comes from and how to give it. On the anniversary of the night I'd sent that accidental text, I found myself awake long after everyone else was asleep. I sat at the kitchen table with my phone in my hand, scrolling back through old messages. That first exchange still made my throat tighten. So much vulnerability compressed into a few lines of text. I thought about how easily it could have ended differently, how silence would have swallowed that message and left my life unchanged, how pride might have kept me from reaching out at all, and I realized the story wasn't really about money or luck or even love. It was about asking, about answering, about the quiet power of seeing another human being and choosing not to turn away. The next morning, as Mateo rushed out the door with his backpack bouncing against his shoulders, he turned back and hugged us both tightly. "I love our family," he said, like it was the simplest truth in the world. And it was. I don't tell this story to suggest that kindness always leads to fairy tale endings. Life doesn't work that way. I tell it because sometimes in the middle of exhaustion and fear, we underestimate how much one small act can matter. A message sent, a response given, a door cracked open just enough for light to get in. I was a poor single mom asking for baby formula money by mistake. What happened next didn't erase the struggle that came before, but it transformed what came after, and it taught me something I carry with me every day. Help doesn't always come from where you expect it, and dignity isn't lost when you ask for it. Sometimes it's found. Life has a way of testing the lessons you think you've already learned. Just when things feel steady, it asks you to prove you understand why they're steady at all. For us, that test came quietly, disguised as opportunity. It started with a phone call my husband received one afternoon while Mateo was at school and I was working from home. I watched his expression change as he listened, his jaw tightening, his gaze drifting out the window. When he hung up, he didn't say anything right away. He made tea instead, moving slowly, thoughtfully, like he was giving his words time to settle. "They want me back," he finally said, handing me a mug. Back was a complicated word. It meant returning to public leadership, to boardrooms and stages, to the world he'd deliberately stepped away from. It meant visibility, scrutiny, a life where privacy becomes a negotiation again. "For how long?" I asked. "Indefinitely," he replied. "They're offering a role that could shape things for years." I took a sip of tea, letting the warmth steady me. "What do you want?" He exhaled. "I want to make a difference, I always have, but I don't want to lose what we've built." Neither did I. And yet I knew that asking him to stay small for my comfort would betray the very values that had drawn me to him. Love isn't about containment, it's about balance. We talked for weeks, not in one dramatic conversation, but in dozens of small ones. Late at night, on walks, over breakfast. We talked about Mateo, about boundaries, about how to protect our family even if the world crept closer again. We talked about my career, about my independence, about making sure I never felt overshadowed or erased. In the end, we said yes, but on our terms. He accepted the role with conditions: limited public exposure, clear lines around our home life, no use of our family as a narrative device. Some people bristled, some walked away, and some respected him more for it. The adjustment wasn't easy. There were weeks when schedules collided and exhaustion returned in familiar waves. But this time we weren't alone in it. We leaned on each other. We adjusted. We remembered why we'd chosen each other in the first place. Mateo noticed the changes too. Children always do. One night, as I tucked him in, he asked if things were going to change a lot. "Some things will," I said honestly, "but the important ones won't." "Like you being here?" he asked. "Like that," I smiled. He nodded, satisfied, and rolled over, already halfway to sleep. There were moments of doubt, of course, moments when headlines reappeared, when strangers felt entitled to opinions about our lives. In those moments, I returned to the version of myself who had once asked for help without knowing who was listening. That woman was scared, yes, but she'd also been brave. She'd trusted her instincts, she'd set boundaries, she'd chosen dignity even when circumstances threatened to strip it away. That woman still lived inside me. One afternoon, I received a message from a young mother through a community forum I volunteered with. She was struggling, embarrassed, apologetic. Her words echoed my own from years ago. I read them slowly, feeling the weight of memory settle into purpose. I answered her, not with money at first, but with reassurance, with resources, with the simple truth that asking for help doesn't make you weak. When I later helped her secure what she needed, I did it quietly, anonymously. Not because I was ashamed, but because the point was never recognition. It was connection. Years from now, Mateo may not remember the details of how our family came to be. He won't remember the nights I cried silently or the fear that once lived in my chest. But he will remember how our home felt, how problems were met with honesty, how kindness wasn't conditional, how strength looked a lot like listening. And maybe one day, when he's grown and the world asks something hard of him, he'll remember that his life began with a mistake that turned into a miracle, not because of luck, but because someone chose to respond with humanity. That's the legacy I care about most. Not the money, not the headlines, just that. As Mateo grew older, the questions he asked became more thoughtful, less about how the world worked and more about why people did what they did. He had a way of looking at things that caught me off guard, like he was already practicing the kind of empathy you can't teach directly, only model. I noticed it one afternoon when he came home from school quieter than usual, his backpack heavier with books and something unspoken. At dinner, he pushed his food around his plate, glancing between me and my husband like he was weighing a decision. Finally, he spoke. A kid at school said families like ours aren't real. The room went still. My husband set his fork down carefully. I felt that familiar tightening in my chest, the instinct to shield, to correct, to fight if I had to. "What did he say?" I asked gently. Mateo shrugged. "I didn't know. I just said he was wrong." I reached for his hand. "And how did that make you feel?" He thought for a moment. "Confused and a little mad, but mostly sad for him." That answer told me we were doing something right. We talked for a long time that night about how families come in many shapes, about how some people only understand what they've seen and how that doesn't make them bad, just limited. My husband shared a bit of his own childhood, about growing up without his father and how long it took him to realize that absence didn't define his worth. Mateo listened, eyes wide, absorbing more than words. "So our family is real," he said finally, not as a question, but a statement. "Yes," my husband said firmly, "because it's built on care. That's what makes it real." Moments like that reminded me that the hardest work of parenting isn't providing or protecting, it's explaining the world without hardening a child's heart against it. Around that time, my work began to shift again. I was offered a leadership role, one that would require travel, longer hours, and a kind of visibility I'd never sought before. Years earlier, I might have turned it down without hesitation, afraid to disrupt the fragile balance I'd fought so hard to create. This time, I didn't say no right away. We sat at the kitchen table, the same one that had once felt too small for my worries, and talked it through. We mapped calendars, we named fears, we asked Mateo how he felt about it too, giving him a voice without putting the burden of decision on his shoulders. "I think you should do it," he said after listening quietly. "You always tell me not to be scared of big things." I smiled at him, heart full. Children notice who we are becoming, not just who we've been. I accepted the role, and just like that, the balance shifted again, not away from us, but into a new shape. My husband took on more at home. I learned to trust that stepping into my own growth didn't mean abandoning my family. It meant expanding what was possible for all of us. There were hard days, missed calls, late flights, guilt that crept in uninvited. But there were also mornings when Mateo left me notes in my suitcase and evenings when my husband listened without trying to fix everything. We were learning still, always. One night, after a long week, I found myself sitting alone in the living room, scrolling through my phone. I stopped at that old message thread again, the one that had started it all. I hadn't opened it in a long time. I didn't need to anymore. The reminder lived in me now. I thought about how many people must send messages like that every day, messages that go unanswered, not because people are cruel, but because they're distracted, overwhelmed, unsure. I wondered how many stories never get a second chapter because the first one ends in silence. That thought stayed with me. So I started something small, a community initiative through my work focused on connecting people with resources quickly, without shame or red tape. It wasn't about charity, it was about dignity, about answering when you can, even if you have nothing to offer but guidance or a listening ear. It grew faster than I expected, not because of my story, most people never knew it, but because the need was there. People want to help, they just need a way in. The night we celebrated the program's first anniversary, Mateo stood beside me, proudly explaining to someone how it worked. I watched him, taller now, more confident, and felt a quiet certainty settle over me. This was the real outcome. Not the money, not the marriage, not even the stability, though all of that mattered. It was the way one moment of vulnerability had shaped a life rooted in compassion instead of fear. When I tucked Mateo in that night, he looked up at me and said, "I'm glad you sent that text." "So am I whispered, because that text taught me that courage doesn't always roar. Sometimes it types a message with shaking hands and presses send anyway. Time has a way of speeding up when you finally feel at home in your life. The years that followed were full, layered, and quietly profound. Mateo grew into a thoughtful teenager, tall and observant, with a habit of listening more than speaking. He carried himself with a calm confidence that didn't demand attention, and when people noticed him, it was usually because of how he treated others. I saw it the first time he came home with a classmate who didn't have a place to stay for the weekend. He didn't make a big announcement. He simply asked if it was okay, already setting up the extra blankets in his room. When I asked him later why he'd done it so naturally, he shrugged. He needed help. You always say that's reason enough. Those words landed deep. They reminded me that values are absorbed, not lectured. Mateo didn't know all the details of how our life began, but he knew the shape of it. He knew what mattered. As for my husband and me, our relationship matured into something steadier than romance alone. We disagreed sometimes, especially when the pressures of public life crept too close to our door. There were moments when old fears resurfaced, mine about losing stability, his about losing control. But we learned how to talk through those moments without letting them calcify into resentment. One evening, after a particularly tense week, we sat on the back porch watching the sky darken. He broke the silence first. "Do you ever think about what would have happened if I hadn't answered?" "All the time," I admitted. He nodded. "I think about it too, not because of where I'd be, but because of who I wouldn't have become." That was the quiet truth of it. Answering that text hadn't just changed my life, it had changed his. It had reminded him why he'd wanted to succeed in the first place, not for accumulation, but for impact. As Mateo approached adulthood, the questions shifted again. This time they were about identity, about where he came from, about his biological father. We never avoided those conversations, even when they were uncomfortable. I told him what I knew, without bitterness or embellishment. My husband made it clear that wanting answers didn't threaten their bond. "You're allowed to be curious," he told Mateo, "and you're allowed to decide what those answers mean to you." That freedom mattered. Mateo chose not to pursue contact, at least not yet. He said he felt complete, grounded. Hearing that didn't erase the past, but it softened it. On Mateo's 18th birthday, we sat together after the guests had left, the house quiet except for the ticking clock. He held a small envelope in his hands, something he'd written himself. He said, voice steady, "I want you to know that I've always known I was wanted, not just loved, chosen." I couldn't speak for a moment, neither could my husband. In that sentence was everything I'd ever hoped for him. Later that night, alone in my room, I let myself cry, not from sadness, but from release, from the understanding that the fear that once ruled my life no longer did. It had been replaced by something stronger, trust, in myself, in others, in the idea that even mistakes can become foundations. I sometimes get messages from women who find pieces of themselves in my story. They ask what the secret was: luck, faith, timing. I tell them the truth, even when it's less comforting. The secret was asking. The secret was answering. The secret was refusing to let shame be louder than need. I was a poor, single mom who sent a text by mistake, but the real turning point wasn't the number I dialed. It was the moment I allowed myself to be seen. And that, I've learned, is something anyone can choose. There's a strange quiet that settles in a house when a child grows up and begins stepping fully into the world. It's not emptiness exactly. It's more like an echo, a reminder of all the voices and moments that shape the walls. When Mateo left for college, I felt that quiet for the first time in a way that caught me off guard. The morning he packed the last of his things into the car, he moved with confidence, but his eyes lingered on familiar corners: the kitchen doorway, the living room window, the staircase he'd slid down as a kid. I recognized that look. It was the same one I'd worn years ago when I stood in a nearly empty apartment, unsure of what came next. "You'll be okay," he said, hugging me tightly, like he sensed the weight in my chest. "So will you," I replied, even though my voice wavered. My husband stood back for a moment, giving us space, then stepped forward and placed a hand on Mateo's shoulder. "Remember," he said, "you don't have to carry the world alone. That's not strength. Knowing when to ask is." Mateo nodded, serious, absorbing that lesson one more time. Then he was gone, driving toward a future he was ready for, leaving behind a home that had done its job. The weeks that followed were an adjustment. I filled my days with work, with projects that mattered, but the evenings were quieter. I found myself returning to memories I hadn't visited in a long time, not with pain, but with curiosity. I thought about the woman I'd been before Mateo, before the text, before fear narrowed my world to survival. I realized something then. That version of me wasn't gone. She'd evolved, strengthened. She'd learned that resilience doesn't mean never needing help. It means not letting need define your worth. One night, my husband and I sat together, sharing a late dinner. He looked at me thoughtfully and said, "Do you ever wonder who we'd be if none of this had happened?" "All the time," I admitted, "but I don't regret who we became because of it." Neither did he. Our life now wasn't flashy, it was purposeful. We'd built systems, foundations, ways of giving back that were sustainable, quiet, and effective. The community initiative I'd started had expanded nationally, run by people who understood the value of meeting others without judgment. We rarely attached our names to it. The work spoke for itself. Occasionally, a journalist would reach out, trying to connect dots, trying to resurrect the story they thought the public wanted. Each time, we declined. Not because we were ashamed, but because the story had already done what it needed to do. It had changed us. Sharing it widely wasn't the point. Still, sometimes I wondered who needed to hear it. Who was sitting on the edge of a bed somewhere, staring at an empty formula can or an overdue bill, debating whether to ask for help? I hoped that if they ever did, someone would answer. Mateo called often from school, sometimes just to tell me about a class discussion or a friend he'd made. One evening, he mentioned he'd joined a volunteer group focused on food insecurity. "I guess it runs in the family," he joked. I smiled, heart full. I guess it does. As the years continued to unfold, I learned that stories don't really end. They just change hands. The lesson that once carried me forward was now something Mateo carried too, shaping his choices, his compassion, his sense of responsibility to the world. And I understood then that the real legacy of that mistaken text wasn't the life I gained, but the lives it would touch long after me. There's a moment in every long story when you realize the ending isn't a single event, but a quiet understanding you arrive at without fanfare. For me, that moment came on an ordinary afternoon years after Mateo had left home. I was sorting through old documents, clearing space in a cabinet that hadn't been touched in ages, when I found a folded piece of paper tucked into the back of a drawer. It was a printed screenshot, the very first text message I'd sent that night. The words looked smaller than I remembered, almost fragile on the page. I'd forgotten my husband had saved it. I sat down slowly, the weight of memory pressing in on me, and let myself read it again. I'm a single mom, and I'm short on baby formula this week. I could almost feel the fear I'd felt when I typed those words, the hesitation, the shame, the quiet hope that had no right to exist but did anyway. I held the paper in my hands and thought about how many versions of my life branched out from that single moment, how close I'd been to deleting the message, how easy it would have been to stay silent. When my husband came home later that evening, I showed it to him. He smiled softly, not with nostalgia, but with reverence, like he understood the gravity of that choice just as deeply. "That was courage," he said simply. I shook my head. It didn't feel like courage. It felt like desperation. "Sometimes they look the same," he replied. As we talked, I realized how much our understanding of success had changed over the years. It wasn't measured in wealth or influence, though those things existed in our orbit. It was measured in how safe people felt with us, in how often we chose to listen instead of fix, in whether our presence made others feel smaller or seen. Mateo visited that weekend. He'd grown into a young man with his own rhythm, his own convictions. Over dinner, he told us about a friend of his who was struggling, too proud to ask for help. "What do you do when someone won't ask?" he asked. I thought carefully before answering. "You stay close, you make it safe, and you wait, because asking has to be their choice." He nodded, thoughtful, and I saw the story continuing through him, reshaping itself for a new generation. That night, after everyone was asleep, I stood at the window and looked out at the quiet street. I thought about the millions of unseen exchanges happening every day, messages sent, messages ignored, opportunities to choose empathy or indifference. My life hadn't been saved by money alone. It had been transformed by response, by the decision of one person to pause, to read carefully, and to answer with humanity instead of suspicion, and by my own decision to accept help without surrendering my dignity. That is what I hope people understand when they hear this story. Not that miracles happen to the lucky, but that they happen to the brave, the open, the willing, to those who choose connection when isolation feels safer. I was once a poor single mom asking for baby formula money by mistake. Today, I am a woman who knows that one small act of kindness can ripple across decades, shaping lives in ways we may never fully see. And if there's one truth I hold on to now, it's this: the most powerful changes in our lives don't begin with certainty. They begin with a question, asked softly, and a voice on the other end that chooses to answer. When people ask me now if I believe in fate, I usually smile before answering. Not because I think everything is written, but because I've learned how much power lives in the smallest decisions. Fate didn't force my fingers to type that message. Fate didn't make someone answer. What happened between those moments was choice, human choice, and that's where the real meaning lives. As the years have continued, our life has remained intentionally quiet. Mateo finished college and found work that mattered to him, not work that impressed strangers. He still calls when he needs advice, and sometimes when he doesn't, just to hear our voices. Those calls are my favorite. They remind me that no matter how far he goes, the foundation we built together travels with him. My husband and I have grown older side by side, our conversations softer, deeper. We laugh more easily now. We forgive faster. We've learned that love isn't proven in grand gestures, but in showing up when it would be easier not to, in listening without preparing a response, in choosing patience when fear tries to rush you. Every once in a while, someone learns pieces of our story and treats it like a miracle, something unreachable or extraordinary. I gently correct them. There was nothing magical about a tired mother asking for help or a stranger choosing compassion. What's rare isn't the circumstance. What's rare is the courage to respond with humanity in a world that often rewards indifference. I keep that printed message in a drawer now, not as a trophy, but as a reminder of who I was, who I became, and who I never want to forget. It reminds me to answer when I can, to stay open, to remember that behind every request is a person doing their best to survive another day. Sometimes, late at night, I imagine another woman sitting where I once sat, a phone glowing in the dark, a heart heavy with need and shame. I hope she presses send, and more than that, I hope someone answers her with kindness. Because the truth is, none of us make it through this life alone. We just like to pretend we do. I was a poor single mom who texted a billionaire by mistake asking for baby formula money. What happened next wasn't a fairy tale. It was better than that. It was real. It was built slowly, imperfectly, through trust, boundaries, and compassion. And it taught me the most important lesson of my life. Help given with respect can change a moment. Help received with dignity can change a future. But empathy, true empathy, can change generations. That is the story I leave behind, not of wealth or rescue, but of connection, of one message, one response, and a life rewritten not by accident, but by choice. Would you like me to continue to part 12 with 1,300 words? Time has a way of sanding down the sharpest edges of memory, but it never erases the shape of what mattered. Even now, when I walk through our home in the early morning, the quiet feels earned, not empty, earned. Every room carries echoes of survival. The nights I paced with a crying baby, the mornings I counted coins, the afternoons I swallowed pride and asked for help. And layered over all of that is something stronger, gratitude. Mateo came home for a visit last spring. He's taller than I remember every time I see him, like he's still growing even though adulthood insists he's finished. We sat at the kitchen table where so many hard conversations once lived. He watched me make coffee, the same way he used to watch me mix formula, and he said something that settled deep in my chest. "Mom," he said, "do you know what the biggest gift you gave me was?" I smiled, already thinking of 100 possibilities. Safety, stability, love. "You taught me that it's okay to ask," he said, "and it's just as important to answer." I had to look away then, blinking back tears I no longer feel ashamed of, because he was right. That lesson traveled farther than any check ever could. It shaped how he treats people, how he loves, how he moves through the world without assuming anyone owes him anything, yet never forgetting that kindness is a responsibility, not a favor. Later that night, after he'd gone to bed, I stood alone in the living room. I thought about the man who received my message all those years ago, how his life could have continued unchanged if he'd ignored it, how mine could have collapsed under the weight of one more unanswered plea. Instead, both our lives shifted, not dramatically, not loudly, but meaningfully. We still exchange messages on holidays, sometimes just a line, sometimes nothing at all. There's no dependency between us, no debt hanging in the air. What exists instead is mutual respect, a quiet acknowledgement that for a brief moment our paths crossed for a reason neither of us fully understood at the time. People often expect some kind of dramatic justice at the end of stories like this, a grand reveal, a public transformation. But real life doesn't tie itself into perfect bows. The reward wasn't fame or fortune, it was peace. It was watching my child thrive without fear. It was waking up without that knot in my stomach, wondering how I would survive another day. If I could speak to the woman I was back then, hunched over a phone in the dark, I wouldn't tell her everything would be okay. That promise feels too fragile. Instead, I'd tell her this: you are stronger than you think, and help does not erase your worth. It reveals your humanity. The world didn't save me. A person did, and then I saved myself, one choice at a time. That's where this story truly ends, not with what I received, but with what I learned to give: patience, humility, and the courage to stay open even after fear tried to close me off. And still, there is one more chapter worth telling, not about struggle, but about legacy. Would you like me to continue to part 13 with 1,300 words? Part 13. Legacy is a quiet thing. It doesn't announce itself. It grows in the spaces between words, in habits passed down without explanation, in the way someone chooses kindness when no one is watching. I didn't realize I was building one until I saw it reflected back at me through my son. A few months ago, Mateo told me about a coworker, a young woman, newly divorced, struggling to afford daycare. He didn't tell me this to impress me. He told me because he was unsure. He wondered where the line was between helping and overstepping, between compassion and pride. I listened, just like someone once listened to me, and I told him what I've learned the hard way. Help should never make someone feel smaller. It should meet them where they are and leave them standing taller. He helped her, quietly, respectfully. No one else knows the details, and that's how it should be. When he finished the story, he paused and said, "I think that's what you did for me, Mom. You never made me feel like we were broken, just human." That was the moment I understood the full circle of it all. I used to think survival was the goal, then stability, then happiness. Now I know the real measure of a life well lived is what continues after you've stopped struggling, what kindness you pass forward, what courage you normalize. I am no longer the woman who typed a desperate message asking for baby formula money, but I honor her. I carry her with me, because without her vulnerability, none of this would exist. If you're listening to this and you're in that place right now, tired, ashamed, scared, I want you to hear this clearly. You are not weak for needing help. You are brave for reaching out, and you have no idea how far one honest message can travel. This story was never about a billionaire. It was about connection, about dignity, about the quiet power of being seen. My life didn't change because someone had money. It changed because someone had empathy, and because I chose again and again to build something good with what I was given. That is where my story ends. Not with riches, not with rescue, but with gratitude, love, and a future shaped by compassion. I've spent a long time thinking about endings, about how stories are supposed to close. We're taught to expect something dramatic, something loud enough to prove that everything meant something. But real endings are rarely like that. They arrive quietly, almost unnoticed, when you realize you no longer ache the way you used to. These days, my life looks ordinary from the outside. I wake up early, I water the plants, I answer messages from my son, from friends, from neighbors who need a cup of sugar or a listening ear. There are no headlines. No one would ever guess that my entire future once balanced on a single text message sent in desperation. And that's exactly how I know the story is complete. I don't replay that night anymore, not because I've forgotten it, but because it no longer defines me. It's a chapter I can close gently, without fear of what happens next. I've learned that survival seasons don't last forever, and neither do miracles. What lasts are the values you carry forward. Sometimes I imagine what might have happened if I hadn't sent that message. Maybe I would have found another way. Maybe not. But I don't live in that version of the world. I live in this one, the one shaped by humility, courage, and an unexpected kindness that taught me how to trust again. I am no longer a poor, single mom struggling to buy baby formula. I am a mother who raised a compassionate man, a woman who learned to receive without losing herself, a person who understands that dignity isn't about never needing help, but about what you do with it once you stand again. If there is one thing I hope you carry with you from this story, it's this. Your lowest moment does not disqualify you from a beautiful future. Sometimes it's the doorway to it, and sometimes all it takes to step through is one honest message sent into the dark. I sent mine, someone answered, and together, without even knowing it, we changed the direction of a life. That's where this story truly ends.